I'm going to turn it over to Sherrod Davis, CEO of EcoMap, so he can introduce our two presenters and we'll get going. We have a lot of great stuff to cover. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather, and welcome everyone. Really appreciate you all joining us today, this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you're calling from. Really excited about today's topic and really excited about today's guests, who I'm going to introduce now. First, we have Annika Horn, who's going to moderate this conversation. Annika is on a mission to help build entrepreneurial ecosystems for social change around the world. Anchored in her belief that a rising tide lifts all boats, she teaches champions and advocates of entrepreneurship how to take a systems approach to supporting the doers, the dreamers, the tinkerers, and the makers in their communities. Rooted at the intersection of systems thinking, social impact, and storytelling, she works to advance the field of ecosystem building through training and consulting, thought leadership, and her podcast, Ecosystems for Change. She works with clients to tell meaningful stories about their ecosystems, the people who nurture them, and how entrepreneurs navigate local assets. Alongside her, we have Robin Lee, who's the Director of Partnerships and Mobilization for Upsurge Baltimore. Robin has been gathering people and cultivating relationships for her entire career, producing hundreds of events, partnerships, and collaborations for organizations in both Baltimore and DC, such as Capitol Riverfront Business Improvement District and Baltimore Homecoming. Robin served as the executive director of Baltimore Homecoming, where she mobilized a network of Baltimoreans across the world to invest in Baltimore City. Being a gatherer outside of work as well, Robin is a founding member of the Baltimore chapter of the National Association of Asian American Professionals, a Thread volunteer, and an advisor to local Baltimore startups. She also serves on the board of Business Volunteers of Maryland and the UMBC Alumni Association. Welcome, Robin and Annika. Thank you so much for doing this. Really excited to hear today's chat.
Thanks, Sherrod.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Robin and I are excited to be here because one thing we both have in common is we love bringing people together. We love bringing people together in a format that is not boring, that does not make people scan the room for the exit sign, and that are convenings that actually catalyze people to take action and to collaborate and to build trust and to be together. So to that end, I would love to hear, Robin, a little bit more about what's the worst convening you were ever at. What is your war story of being in a room in a convening that served no purpose, was poorly facilitated, and just made you want to find the exit?
Yeah, absolutely. Annika, glad to be and excited to be in conversation with you. First of all, you definitely have to like rewrite my bio. I loved your bio. And I would love to take this opportunity to share a little bit about Upsurge Baltimore to give context before I kind of jump into my worst ESO or worst kind of like convening experience. And so for those of you who don't know, like my bio stated, I'm the Director of Partnerships and Mobilization for Upsurge Baltimore. Upsurge Baltimore is the tech ecosystem builder here in the Baltimore region. And so we really work with the different stakeholder groups that we think should and need to lean in with our tech startups to build a thriving tech ecosystem. I'll leave it at that because we're going to get into a lot of more details. So Annika, to answer your question, my worst convening experience, to be honest, I've been in this role for about a year now, and it was one of my first ESO convenings, right? And so I'll caveat that like I didn't know my own personal role in it because I was so new to the role, new to the team. And so I really was an observer. And what I observed in this convening that I thought was not great and serves as a motivator to how we've created convenings afterwards was that the main thing was that people didn't know the purpose, right? Didn't know the purpose for themselves as individuals or for their organizations. And honestly, we were all brought together probably because we were obligated to due to a grant. And so there was like some funding strings attached, right? And so I think that it made for more of a clunky convening, and it didn't feel purpose driven. And so that I would say characterized like the worst, let's just say not the worst, but maybe like, the starting point on which we could build on more impactful convenings. So that's what I would start with. That was a very, very clear why it was not a great experience, but I think that it served as a great launching off point.
I can't wait to dive deeper into this. Um, I don't know about everyone's experience in the room, obviously, but I can certainly tell that pre-COVID, we would convene kind of run of the mill, get together, have chats, sometimes do something. And I have found that after we went through COVID with a lot of online virtual engagements and then came back to mostly in person, or maybe even just partly in person, how can we leverage convenings, you think, Robin, to bring ESOs together in the entrepreneurial ecosystem? Why is it so important? I think, especially after we've all gone through this collective experience, um, why does it matter to have these meaningful convenings in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I think what's really, really important, especially given the context you shared, that like we went from this like totally virtual world into to then hybrid and then in person and then somewhere in between since then, is that no knock on virtual gatherings, but virtual gatherings are just not as powerful in terms of building trust, especially with your peers and those that are, you know, doing similar work. So when it comes to ESOs coming together, those in-person gatherings and or hybrid gatherings are really important to continue to build that trust so that we can actually walk the walk when we talk about collaboration, right? I think with I'm just like kind of walking back memory lane and the virtual gatherings where, you know, we would talk about the things that we wanted to do, that we were working on separately, kind of in our silos. And that's one layer. But to be able to kind of really connect with each other as human beings, it's harder to do so virtually. And then now it's like you got to layer in those in-person moments so that we could connect to each other as humans, so that we could then trust each other, and therefore when those collaboration opportunities arise, we're more likely to be able to and to capitalize on those moments. So that's what I would say.
Relying on your experience with UpRise, which we'll talk about in more detail here in a few minutes, what are some of the upsides of doing it well, of getting it right, of hosting a meaningful convening? What happens as a result?
So I think like what's really special when I see these impactful convenings, it's like, yes, you have the meeting goal, and of course it's a win if you achieve that meeting goal. However, there are so many other ancillary things that happen when we convene. For example, like this entity A and B like have been meaning to talk to each other, but they haven't been able to find time on each other's scheduling links, but they were in this meeting together, and because they were able to kind of catch a moment while they're both headed to the restroom or just, you know, between meeting topics or something like that to chat, they were able to move forward on whatever they're working on together, just as an example. And so that's just one of like, does that happening dozens of times at an impactful convening, and you almost got to build that in. I would say I think we're going to talk more about like the ingredients for an impactful convening, but one really important thing that we strive to always do is to have unprogrammed, open, and or unprogrammed and or low programmed time so that that natural convening can happen. I know we call it networking, but I don't like to call it networking. I call it, you know, time for connection, just, you know, unprogrammed time for this magic to happen on its own and organically as well.
Robin, what's your hunch? Why is it so tricky for ESOs or even convening organizations to host such meaningful events? I mean, you make it sound really easy to do it well and to do it effectively. What do you think gets in the way of that happening over and over?
Yeah. Well, I'll say that we feel this challenge as well as an ecosystem builder, but less so because we're an ecosystem builder. And the difference between an ecosystem builder and an ESO, I think in large part to answer this question, is that as an ecosystem builder, it's our responsibility to kind of have a overarching viewpoint and or ear to the ground about what everyone's challenges are so that we can set up these convening goals or purposes around those, right? But whereas with ESOs, I mean, we have our ESOs have their own kind of constituencies, whether it's portfolio companies or entrepreneurs that they're serving. And so we often, and this is not just in ESOs, this is like across industries and sectors, have our own objectives, our own challenges when it comes to your constituency. And so often people feel like they're working in silos because they are, and not for any reason of malice. It's really just a reason that really just because they are trying to really serve the people they serve, right? And so that's why I think that our role as an ecosystem builder is really important to help people kind of like pick their heads up out of their holes, and to identify those opportunities for collective growth, to identify the commonalities when it comes to like challenges across organizations. Like, when you're in a hole, you feel like you're the only one kind of experiencing this challenge, but lo and behold, there's probably a dozen other ESOs that are experiencing the same challenge. And so we can only really get to that if we stay connected, build trust, and are in constant communication with each other. And convenings are just an important way to keep those regular activities going.
I agree. Fabian Fortmüller, who's the co-founder and CEO of Community, gave a Firestarter talk like 7 years ago at the eShip Summit, and he said, a community needs a heartbeat. And he meant we need these consistent convenings. They don't have to be over-engineered. They don't have to be super fancy catered. You just bring people together and give them a chance to talk and exchange and be heard and be seen. And I think that's really important. Robin, I'd love to talk more about the UpRise cluster, the Baltimore region UpRise cluster, because the reason we're here today is that you guys have figured something out that so many other ecosystem builders are still learning. Can you tell us more about what the cluster is and what part convenings play, how often they take place, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Baltimore Region UpRise Cluster is the name of our Regional Innovation Cluster, which is powered by an SBA contract through the Regional Innovation Cluster initiative. So just background, we received this contract fall of last year of 2024, but to be honest, we were really funded because this work was already underway, and we were essentially getting funded to continue to do the ecosystem building and the convening work that we were already doing. Let me back it up another step. This all came to be when we, as a region and a consortium of about 40 to 50 organizations, came together to put a proposal together for the EDA Tech Hubs process. Thereabouts like November of 2023. But through that, we the biggest feat out of that was that for the first time, our region was able to submit one proposal, aka like we were actually able to work together and not in like different pockets and silos and things like that. So that was a really big milestone for our region. And what came out of it was an ESO network. It was 18 ESOs that actually signed a joint commitment letter to say we want to work together to build to continue this network that we think is really important. And it was under the auspice of 3 common goals. And I kind of harkening back to what we first talked about, like the worst convening, like unclear purpose and goals is the Achilles heel of any convening, right? And so for this network, we had 3 common purposes. One was essentially to talk to each other, which sounds so rudimentary, but is so absolutely fundamental and necessary. Because, Baltimore, our region and our innovation ecosystem is not quite big enough to have multiple demo days conflicting on the same night. Let's just be honest about that, right? We would hope to be that type of ecosystem in the future, but we're a small ecosystem. And so let's commit to talking to each other so that we can coordinate demo days and or talk about what events are happening when and where so that we can amplify each other's. and or address, entrepreneur challenges and business challenges together as opposed to in a silo, right? So first purpose was to just agree to talk to each other, right? Second was to share data. One of the things that we realized was a big miss for a lot of ecosystems is that there are so many different data sets that have different lexicons, definitions, and therefore on their own are not as powerful as if they could all be put together and extrapolated from in a common language. And so these 18 ESOs signed up for being able to signed up for sharing their data with us as a central entity, as Upsurge, so that we can build an ecosystem-wide startup data set, because that will end up benefiting the rest of our ecosystem because we will be able to share this data set with external investors who might be interested in all of our companies and portfolio companies. It will help when we go for funding opportunities, a way to cite the same data sources. So anyways, before I get too deep into that, that's the second purpose. So first was to talk to each other. Second was to share data. And third was to collaborate on a digital resource hub that can serve as a one-stop shop for resource navigation for our entrepreneurs across the ecosystem. So similar to what I said about data, when there are all these sources across the ecosystem that are all helpful, but it's always challenging when entrepreneurs get sent all these different directions. One might be outdated, one might be stronger in one industry or sector, and so forth. And so we've agreed that it would benefit all of us to have one-stop shop for entrepreneur resource navigation and a digital platform, right? And so hence why we have adopted EcoMap's platform to be the engine for our Be More Tech Connect, which is effectively the resource hub for our region. So those are the three purposes of the Baltimore region UpRise cluster. Before it was just called our ESO network, but we started convening regularly, quarterly, and through that work, we've become a more official cluster when it comes to the SBA contract. With that being said, I know, Annika, you were asking about convening. So I talked about the quarterly convenings. Those are really important because as much as we stood up a Slack to talk to each other, it's that culture building. Like, we're not used to it yet. And so we still meet quarterly to try to stoke the conversations to continue on Slack and or spark conversation on Slack and then continue them in the quarterly convenings, that type of thing. And so it's all of them are ingredients to building a new culture of connectivity, which I think has been the norm of non-connectivity of like silos. We're trying to break that down and shift it towards a culture of much more connectedness. I will also share that the convenings are always typically linked up with what we call an evening with the ESOs, which is part of Upsurge's Equitech Tuesdays. I could talk about that in a moment, but it is a low program connecting time, relationship building time with the tech community. And so we have our meetings 4:30 to 6, and then it'll roll into the evening with ESOs from 6 to 8. That's for the broader innovation ecosystem to come out, meet with the ESOs, because those are the people, the faces behind a lot of the programming that's powering our innovation economy. It's always one of our most well-attended gatherings. And like we mentioned before, it's low program because it's really about those organic connections happening. So I feel like I've scratched the surface. Annika, where would you like me to dive in next?
I want to go all the places with you because this is so fun and so insightful. First off, I think you're almost like providing double value because you're convening the ESOs, but you're also giving them an outlet to meet entrepreneurs and innovators, which we all know, if you're not meeting with the people you're serving, you can't know what's really going on, or you have second or third hand information. So I think it's really smart. You almost have like a double value proposition of convening with the ESOs, but then also getting in with the founders who you want to hear from, and just keep your finger on the pulse, which I think is awesome. Robin, can you give a little bit of insight into how these 90 minutes go, these quarterly convenings? So I know there's connection time. Is
Yep.
there a set agenda that you stick to that is really working? What can you share with us about the actual structure of these meetings?
Yeah. Let me start by saying that Upsurge sees ourselves as an organization as the steward of this ESO network, of this cluster, and not and intentionally not like the leader of it, right? And so that means that I'm responsible for keeping my ear to the ground about what the other ESOs are kind of experiencing, so that I can bring them into this meeting agenda, right? And so meeting agenda strategically, it is I do spend a lot of time having individual conversations with each of our ESOs in our cluster. And do I get to all 18 between every meeting? No, but sometimes things that organically happen when we're in meetings together that are outside of this cluster or for the cluster. And therefore I'm able to make those links to say like, oh, we're all struggling with DE&I language, for an example. So how about that should be a meeting topic, because that's something that, I can imagine ESO 1 is just like trying to figure out, how to approach it for their own organization. And we can gain a lot of value from learning from each other, right? What have we learned? How are you approaching it? How are you thinking about it? What's your perspective? And so forth. And so, so our meeting agenda will often look like a discussion, one or two discussions about things that we're all struggling with or that we're all faced with. I will also ask, what else would you like to bring to the table, whether it's promoting your upcoming event or promoting a program or an application window, or a big win for your startups. So I typically like to incorporate a lot of that into the agenda, because it's not what Upsurge wants to talk about. It's what all of the ESOs in this cluster would like to use this space and time for. And then we also build in some open forum time, because I can only get to so many people as a conduit, and so we always make it an opportunity for folks to connect with each other as well. And I will say that we always try to go back to the common purposes, right? So one, Slack, communicating with each other. We talk about it. We talk about what's working, what's not, because I'll be honest, we're not perfect. Just building a culture of where you talk on Slack is already challenging in itself. And so we're trying to we're co-creating ideas on like how to stoke that behavior change or adoption. We try to talk about data sharing and give updates on the shared data set and things like that. And then we also definitely continue to talk about how we build and strengthen that digital platform for resource navigation. So like I mentioned, Be More Tech Connect. And so there are definitely steps to that. It's not all of a sudden like overnight that everyone's using this platform, period, right? And so a lot of those steps happen between meetings and during these meetings as well. Like, okay, now ESOs, we need you to claim your profile. Okay, now we need you to update your profiles. Okay, now we're hearing that people are having challenges, so let's all do an onboarding with our EcoMap representatives, so that we can all have more knowledge about how to navigate this and how to maximize the platform for us. And then this new feature is getting rolled out. Okay, how do we maximize this? And then and so forth. So there's those three things we always continue to go back to, because they're the core why we are together.
So just to repeat back what I'm hearing, there are these pretty standardized things you touch on all the time because that's the main purpose of these convenings, but you also create space for just information sharing and exchange, and then talking about some really relevant, meaty discussions that are important that peers might want to talk about and try to figure out together. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Robin, how long have you been convening in this way?
Well, I will take that question in different layers. So, objectively, only a year,
Yeah.
since I joined. And so when we're talking about the ESO convenings, has been effectively like we've had 4 ESO convenings, but they each one have been really, really impactful. However, when you talk about personally, how long have I been doing this? I mean, I've been doing this for um, almost 15 years in different ways and for different organizations and things like that. And a lot of these elements that I just talked about have been tried and true, and regardless of context, have been really effective. The element of, co-creation when it comes to the meeting agenda, the element of low program time or like unprogrammed time, or is a really important element as well. And then always just anchoring on the common goals, I would say are things that have I've held true in any of the communities I touch.
I find this really instructional. I think if anyone here on this call is figuring out how to host such a convening, you've just given us some really, really specific bullet points of what to pay attention to and what to do. And needless to say, this kind of stuff gets a little easier with practice, right? I mean, you've been doing it for 15 years. I don't expect anyone on this call to just run with it and have the most impactful. I mean, you may still have the most impactful ESO convening you've ever had, but these things also take time, and in different cultures, they work differently. With the UpRise cluster, is there anything that you're surprised by since you started these convenings? Is there anything you've learned? Anything, yeah, surprising or unexpected?
I will say that it's maybe not so much surprising coming out of our cluster, is that something that we do as an ecosystem builder is actually go to other ecosystems so that we could try to learn from each other. I think one of the eventual goals is to make some sort of like national cluster of ESO stewards or something like that. So as we're going to other ecosystems, we've learned that the simple shared platform for communication between ESOs is something that's missing from a lot of ecosystems. I think that's what I was surprised to hear about. And it just underscored my preconception that we all work in silos. And I was like, oh, yeah, maybe we kind of do. And maybe this is just like a low-hanging fruit that I feel like a lot of ecosystems could adopt. Again, I'm totally acknowledging it's hard. It sounds easy, like objectively get everyone on the same platform, but it's actually very hard. And so I would say that's something that I was surprised to hear about. But now that we're in the work, I'm not surprised by how hard it is, because everyone's running 1,000 miles per hour, and sometimes it's hard to get people to slow down to the same pace as each other. So yeah.
Since we promised everyone on this webinar to have a no fluff conversation, what do you find is the hardest part about these convenings? Is it the logistics and the scheduling? Is it the people? What is stuff that is maybe even harder than you expected?
Well, logistics and those type of things, not hard. Well, I'll say that from, years of experience kind of throwing these things together. I think sometimes the hardest part is like getting folks to pick their heads out of their holes and kind of think about how their work connects to the greater whole. Right? Like I talked about the example of any ESO, like an accelerator will probably be very focused on programming their accelerator, supporting their portfolio companies, marketing their programming, and so forth. And that rightly so, because that's like, what they're meant to do. But how do these portfolio companies matriculate into the greater innovation economy or ecosystem? How are you sourcing uh, potential companies to join your accelerator? Like those are very ecosystem wide things to think about, which sometimes is the harder part because we're so sometimes in the weeds. And so I think that's why we take this cluster and the stewardship of this cluster very seriously, because it is like, I think I'm quoting your bio, like all boats, you're going to know it better. The all boats rise with the same.
The rising tide, yeah.
Yes, that whole metaphor. So how can we all learn from each other so that we're all growing in the service that we're doing? So
I agree. You mentioned something earlier that I just want to kind of come back to. I think there's this perception of, oh, like having a dedicated program to convene ESOs is really easy when you have the money to do so, right? And money being the stand-in for capacity, resources, and just having someone who can dedicate their time to that. But you also mentioned that this didn't start as soon as you got funding. This actually, it started and then you found funding to be able to continue to do that.
yeah.
What is your advice to an ecosystem that doesn't have funding for this kind of thing and wants to convene the ecosystem in a meaningful way?
Yes, I think my advice is it doesn't need funding to necessarily. Funding only helps. So I think the best way to kind of communicate is to really share about what we were doing before the funding, what we were doing before the contract was even on our radar. And so even before the ESO network was established, Upsurge saw itself as the instigator, when we talk about the startup community way, we need the instigators and a regular set of activities to stoke that energy in the innovation ecosystem. And so one of the first things Upsurge did when it established only about 4 years ago was to have a weekly tech community gathering. And weekly, it was important that it was weekly because, yeah, we had speaker series and or other gatherings or meetups that happen kind of on the monthly, maybe bi-weekly, but there was nothing that was just like very, very, very consistent, right? And so I don't remember the exact number we're at, but I believe our Equitech Tuesday coming up is 189. So we number them because I think it's really significant that we think about how this is all part of this intentional effort to have those regular activities. So with Equitech Tuesdays in the first couple of years before I joined Upsurge, the most important part was that they were regular and consistent. They happened at the same restaurant at first when it was like a couple dozen people or maybe a dozen people for the first couple dozen convenings. And then it grew. And so then it went to a brewery with a little bit more space. So prior to me joining, it had probably been at Guilford Hall Brewery for about 1.5 to 2 years consistently, right? And so we were seeing a cool set of familiar faces and new faces every week. But what I realized was like we had this opportunity to really leverage this this brand, this following to expose different parts of our ecosystem to this tech community and to expose the tech community to different parts of our ecosystem as well. So we started layering different forms of capital into this existing event/program by moving around different parts of our ecosystem. So what that would look like was definitely with warm relationships, right? Built either, individually, people I knew or people in the ESO network even before it became an ESO network who were willing to lend their space. That's physical capital, right? Like, because people were very much interested, like, oh, Equitech Tuesday is at this university or at this accelerator space. I've never been there. I'd love to see where innovation happens, right? And so we started moving around. People would come because of that. Then we'd also cut different themes. So before, Equitech Tuesday was Equitech Tuesday. It would just open for everyone to come, everyone from tech curious to exited founders and everyone in between. And then we started doing themes like climate tech meetup or let's talk about AI or mother entrepreneurs, right? Entrepreneurs who are mothers. And so when we started doing these different themes, people could prioritize differently. You know, like when you have 4 Equitech Tuesdays on your calendar throughout the month, like how do you prioritize which one you go to? But if you're a medtech founder and you see a medtech Equitech Tuesday, then you're going to go to that one, right? And so then okay, we have the 7 capitals up on the screen. Then you're kind of layering intellectual capital into it because you're going to meet people who are more, experts in this field. We talked about the network capital is kind of the obvious one, right? Cultural capital being, it's always an inclusive space, and people have built the culture of like, okay, Tuesdays when you're in Baltimore or the Baltimore region, on Tuesdays, this is what we do, right? You're part of that culture. I talked about layering physical capital by kind of moving it around. And that way you're also tapping into different geographic communities, right? And then also, we don't do this alone. We do this with partners and collaborators. And so the institutional capital, meaning like some of the institutions in Baltimore are absolutely some of our partners in these gatherings, so that they're part of, what's going on the ground. We could be leveraging the resources of these institutions as well. So just talking through layering the 7 forms of capital through this one example, and again, going back to what you started with, Annika, like how did we do this without money? We did it with a lot of relationship capital, right? We were willing to take the time to talk and lean in with collaborators to be able to move it around to different spaces and so forth. When it came to food and beverage, of course, that costs money, but a lot of times our gatherings were just like, what do you call it? Pay on your own. If we hosted a brewery, people just come, buy their own drinks, buy their own food. You don't always have to feed people or, create opportunities for food, but you don't have to give free food every time. I think if people want to gather, they will gather. And so when this contract came around and there's now funding for some of these activities, we are now able to just lower the barriers. If this partner wanted to host, but they don't have a budget to put a bar or a cater food, it's outside of their budget line items, not a problem. Now we have a budget to do it. But I will say that has not always been the case, and we've always been able to make do without funding. And the value that we've gotten out of the convenings that weren't funded were immense. And so we really highly recommend folks really just take the time and effort to collaborate on these types of convenings, because that's how you'll kind of co-create that value with everyone in the ecosystem.
I think you make such an important point of these convenings don't have to be expensive.
Yeah.
I think if you can partner up with others or you keep the costs at least accessible, people have skin in the game and will show up. And I think you guys sometimes have drink tickets. I mean, there's like an in-between way if you have a little bit of funding, but don't let that get in the way. And honestly, I don't think that most people expect to be fed and have cocktails served at some kind of connection time. They don't care.
Yeah.
And as long as you always have tap water there, no one has to be there with an empty hand, even if they can't afford it. Shout out to the scrappy startup founders that, live off ramen all the time. You've shared so much insight into how this works. And I just want to point out for everyone here, just because wonderful Robin here makes it sound very easy and like she just did this in her sleep, I know from experiences this takes so much longer than we care to admit, that so many unforeseen things sometimes come up, snow days or power outages or God knows what. But don't let that stop you. I think you just start. And even if you start with 5 people who show up, you will find that as long as you do it consistently, you keep it accessible, sometimes things just have to get into a rhythm and they will start to develop a dynamic on their own. And before you know it, maybe a year from now, you'll be, whoever this is, Denise Rodriguez will be on this webinar sharing about how all of this is working in Puerto Rico. So don't let any of this stop you. Just start with the right intention and keep it accessible. Robin, I know we have a lot of questions, but I do want to ask at least one more of my own. before I hand it over to the audience. Are there any tools that you have found have made this a little easier, a little bit more effective? Is there any technology you can use? I know you already use Slack, but are there other resources and tools that you have found everybody else should know about?
Yeah. Yes, and I wanted to leave with a couple of things that we do that are very actionable, and this definitely ties into your question of what tech do we use as well. First, I want to say, so, quoting Heather when we were doing the pre-call, email is not dead. So we have our newsletter called the Upshot, where we source all these different links. It probably typically has about 100 links in it per newsletter of different resources, opportunities, news, articles, things like that about our ecosystem. And that's sourced because we're connected to the ecosystem of ESOs and so forth. And so they are able to help us they are the content, and we just kind of put it all together and push it out, right? So yes, great plug for our newsletters that are up on the screen right now. But as all additional to our newsletter, we have a separate group that's our Equitech Tuesday group, right? The difference between our newsletter probably reaches more of a national audience because people are trying to get insight as to like what's going on in the Baltimore tech ecosystem. But Equitech Tuesday is a lot more localized because these are people who are actually interested in coming to the weekly gatherings. And the thing that I love about our our Equitech Tuesday e-blast is that it elevates the voices of the ecosystem. So it is not me writing it every week. It is creating an opportunity for each of our Equitech Tuesday collaborators to share, to give them the space to share their perspective on the ecosystem, to highlight any of the founders and startups that they want to highlight, to give props and shout outs to any other individuals or organizations that they're working with. And we've gotten such positive feedback about that because it really helps people reading it to get to know the people behind the entrepreneurial support that is such a backbone to our innovation ecosystem. And so that's one thing I'll share is tech, meaning like email is not dead. You just have to be thoughtful about how you leverage that space because obviously there's so many demands on everyone's attention. So I'm not saying our way is the best way, but that is just a way that has been successful for us. I'm going to take a step back from tech because this is low tech. One of the small things we do that people really love and has helped to build a culture around our convenings is that, and Heather, if you could pull up the slide with our Equitech Tuesdays on it, we actually have the 3 colors of wristbands that everyone can expect to see at any Equitech Tuesday and or convening, ESO convening. So it helps to identify your founders, your funders, and your friends. You could, of course, select different identifiers, but then as people kind of come back, because the goal is for people to come back to any of these convenings, right? They're wearing the wristbands. They have pride in the fact that they're a founder or funder or friend. And so that's something that has been just like such a low tech way to build a culture of convening and connectivity. So just want to share that. And then go in the other direction, another tech thing. Obviously, I'm going to underscore our EcoMap platform, Be More Tech Connect. There are so many different platforms that already exist, but what we agreed as a network is that it is beneficial for us all to have one platform that we direct people to, right? And so it is really important in that sense because and we're able to, I think one of the greatest values that I'll say personally is that we can kind of co-create this, the future of our platform with EcoMap, because we're getting that like feedback directly from our ESOs as to what they need, what they're looking for, what their entrepreneurs are looking for. And so it's a very malleable tool, platform and tool for us. And so that's something I'm really excited about and an important piece of our tech stack. because ultimately, as an ecosystem builder, beyond connecting with just our cluster, we're connecting with so many other people who are like, that just want to get involved, right? And so whether they're investors and or corporate partners and or national ESOs or so forth, it is so challenging to case by case figure out where everyone should land. But if you have one place or platform where you can direct everyone, then that is just a way to streamline all that goodwill and partnership opportunity into one place. And you could kind of build from there. And so I would say those three things. Having a digital platform for resource navigation, so important. Email is not dead. Continue to use it in a thoughtful way. And think of low-tech things you could do too. Shared about the wristbands, but I'm sure there are other things that other folks on this call are already doing that could elevate that culture of connectivity.
What a perfect segue, Robin. For everyone on this call, thank you for being here. This is not farewell, but we thought rather than doing just a webinar, what we would love to hear from all of you, which we can bring 80 plus people onto the screen, but we set up a survey to gather some of the ideas that are already working for you. The idea being, this is not just a webinar and you'll never hear from us again. We're going to put our heads together to see what we learned today and what is working for you guys, what kinds of questions you have. So the more of you who fill out this survey, the more insight we'll have. And Ecomap has generously offered to just compile all of the resources and have a follow-up, probably some kind of blog post where we share what we learned today, plus everything that you guys have contributed. So if you could please take a second, take out your phones, which might already be out, and scan this QR code. We'd love for you to fill out this survey so that we also can learn from each other and not just pick Robin's brain, which, by the way, I have super enjoyed. Thank you so much, Robin. I know there's a lot of questions. We have 10 minutes, which is so much more than I typically have. So Heather, can I kick it over to you to see what the questions are?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. I'm just going to start going through them. But for the audience, if we don't get to your question live, we will answer the questions and get those responses back out to everyone. So let's start from the top, or maybe the bottom. For you, Robin, do you create a yearly or quarterly strategic plan for your ESO convenings?
Great question. Let me start with saying that personally, I've geared a lot of my education and professional development towards strategic planning and or leadership development, things like that. And absolutely what's trending now, what we're trending towards is less long-term, more dynamic strategic plans. So actually we plan on a quadrimester system, which is 4 months of the year, because 3 months is too short, and like otherwise 4 months it makes a huge difference. So we actually plan in that way. And honestly, our quarterly convenings though are very responsive to what's going on in that quarter. So I will not say we try to plan them for like a year out. We do schedule them, meaning like we put them on the calendar, but when it comes to leading up to that, I start to plan the convening a month ahead, not farther, not less either, because a month ahead really helps us to listen to what we're hearing with our ear to the ground and to be able to build it into those convenings. So I'll leave it at that. I'm a huge proponent of being dynamic and responsive to the needs of what's going on right now.
Great. Okay, Rob Cohen asked early in the conversation about how you're funded, and I know you spoke to that a little bit, but he had a follow-up question about how are you measuring success and impact. So I think you spoke to that a little bit, but maybe if there's more you want to say.
Yeah. So I wish we had another hour to go over metrics and such, because we are a very metric driven organization. But as a summary, we do definitely track a lot of the typical metrics of like how many people you're engaged, how many convenings happen, how many people engage, and by different segments, how many are founders, how many are ESOs, things like that. But we also track some ancillary or influenced metrics. For example, amount of funding that has been secured by our cluster, influenced by our cluster activities. For example, if we elevated this opportunity for a grant or a fund, and someone in our cluster went after it and wins it, like we see that as a ecosystem success, right? And so that's another metric that we do measure success by. And so that does inform how we structure these convenings, because that's one of our metrics. So I won't go into too high of depth, but that is definitely a type of metric that we are tracking, that has us forces us to think about impact.
That sounds like a great follow-up webinar. Okay, well, along the lines of data, we had a few questions such as like, what data are ESOs sharing with each other in your ecosystem?
Yeah. Specific to our initiative, we ask them to share with us, well, first, colloquially in the Slack channel, we're hoping that we're trying to get our ESOs to really share startup wins with each other, just so of their portfolio companies, like who's raising, who just closed a round, who was just acquired, or who just got FDA approval, like that type of thing. Because culturally, we want to just be able to celebrate these wins, right? So I would say that's one type of data. The other type, the other more objective type is startup data. So when it comes to like who the founders are, what their traction is, what their funding raise, things like that. We believe in a culture of data transparency, and that's the only way you can get to kind of more of a shared definitions of what growth stage means to one company versus another ecosystem and so forth. And so we are asking them to share with us that information. We can absolutely get a lot of that from publicly sourced data like PitchBook, Crunchbase, but we also need to validate that information, right? And then the idea is that once we have that base level of objective data, we as an ecosystem builder and a network of ESOs can layer startup intelligence so that we can activate those stakeholder groups that are all connected with in the best ways possible. So for example, say we have a startup database that's fully fleshed out with just the basic information about who the startups are, what their industries are, and their stages. Then we could also add in intelligence of like, okay, well, this company is about to start raising, or this company is experiencing this business challenge. So then when an investor is interested in either supporting as a mentor and or investing, we're able to kind of provide that information so that their pathway to support our ecosystem startups is very, very clear, right? And so you see why that's a win-win-win-win-win for everyone involved. And so that's the type of data that we are looking for and sourcing and looking to share out as well. Oh,
Yeah, I was going to say there's another data related question. It might take us over time. So Mark, if you're still here, we might have to get back to you. But Mark said centralized data sounds great, but it isn't a one-time thing. How are you keeping it all up to date with so many organizations involved? I know you were just talking a little bit about that, but anything you want to add there about how you actually do maintain it?
yeah. Right now, I'll be honest that we're still in the building phase. So we don't have something that's fully fleshed out yet, but we are endeavoring to do so. And I think the idea is that we have a network of data partners. So this ESO network doubles as or as a data partner network, right? And so as we gather regularly, we're also regularly in communication with them, or providing ways for them to update data to us. So we're still trying to figure out what that exactly looks like, but we let's be honest, we've only had a couple of cycles of this, and so we haven't established like the way we're doing it. But the idea is that it's a network of data partners that you're constantly you have relationships with, and that you're constantly in connection with. And you can build in that regular connectivity through existing convenings and or channels. So that would be the idea. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think we're going to need to throw it to Sharad to thank you both and wrap things up, but I'm going to also share on screen one more time the QR code so folks can participate in that survey as well. So why don't I throw it to Sharad or Robin and Annika? If there's anything last words you want to say too, you all have the floor now.
I've said a lot.
Annika,
Yeah, I will just say thank you for having me. I love talking about convening. I think it is one of the most important ecosystem builder skills that we all need to continuously sharpen so that we can bring people together who trust each other and are willing to collaborate. So hopefully this was just a first webinar in a series of more. I don't know what I'm committing myself to an ego map, but this is great. I so look forward to seeing what is working for other people and continuing the conversation. Sharad?
what else is there to say? Thank you, Annika. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Really appreciate it. As Heather mentioned, there will be a series of things coming out as a result of this webinar. And so we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again. Bye.